Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. My name is Yoshi Domoto. I'm the Executive Director of the Japan America Society of Georgia, and I'm so thrilled to have so many of you today joining us for our fourth edition of our webinar series. Today, we will be discussing how medical technology companies are fighting COVID-19. We have two special guest panelists with us today from the Georgia Institute of Technology. We have the Chair of Engineering and Entrepreneurship, Dr. David Koo. And then from Fluida, CEO of Fluida and recent Atlanta local, we have Dr. Jan de Bakker. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I know we only have about an hour today, so we'd like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Nozomi Morgan, the CEO and founder of Michiki Morgan Worldwide.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Yoshi-san. There's so much to cover today, but I first wanted to start with actually an introduction. If you can quickly and as simply as you can, share the work that you do, share about your company.
Pleasure. So, first of all, thanks for having me. It's really great to be with you to discuss Medtech and how we can tackle these COVID-19 issues. But in Fluida, we've been developing what we call functional respiratory imaging. So we very much focused on respiratory for the last 15 years. And what the technology does is we start from high-resolution CT scans, so just the conventional scans that everybody knows that the scanners are available in all modern hospitals. And we convert those CT scans into 3D reconstruction of the anatomical structures such as the airways, the blood vessels, the low volumes. And then what we do is we use methods from aerospace engineering, which is my background, that allow us to simulate flows using computers. So what we then do is we take these 3D reconstructions from the CT scans and we simulate the flow through the lungs, through the airways. So the end result is a very accurate assessment of the regional lung structure and the regional lung function, so we can see how healthy or diseased the lung really is. And that will come in very handy in the COVID-19 era, where it's very much understanding in an early stage how diseased the patient, how diseased the lungs of those patients really are. So that's in a nutshell what we've been doing for the last 15 years.
Wonderful, thank you. That really helped to get an idea of what you do. So let's go to Dr. Koo, if you can share about your work that you do.
Okay, I wear a bunch of different hats. I'm primarily a professor at Georgia Tech, where we study heart disease and strokes and try and understand how you get them and how to better treat that so you can prevent the heart attacks and strokes. About 20 years ago, I started my first company, and it ended up going in a different direction. We developed a biomaterial that could be used for knee cartilage, and that company now was formed as Salumedica, then morphed into Cartiva. That was bought out by Wright Medical, and Wright Medical is now being bought out by Smith & Nephew. But the company is still based in Atlanta, here in Smyrna. And that company makes knee cartilage for patients with arthritis. So you can get back walking actually by the next day. Currently, most of our work is in other fields, more towards the cardiovascular area. There's one that I'll talk about that could be used in the COVID apparatus, and it's being used actually at MIT and in India and in Italy. So we'll talk about that in my talk later on. And the other part that I do is teach at the business school. So most of my research is really on fluid mechanics, but I teach in entrepreneurship in the business school at Georgia Tech.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have two amazing entrepreneurs here. So let's get into it. So how has this COVID-19 shifted the work you do?
So I think the COVID-19 situation actually accelerated a lot of the things that we were doing before. So just to give you an idea of how the lung works, so the lung has a remarkable capability of compensating for disease. So you can actually have a lot of disease present already without showing symptoms, without actually having lung function decline. We see that in asthma, we see that in COPD, cystic fibrosis, and so on. So what our technology does by using the CT scans and very much opening up the black box, you can see how healthy or diseased the lung specifically is. And so once we heard these rumors coming out of China saying there's this virus and leads to lung diseases, it was something that really triggered us, especially if you looked at the typical clinical path of a patient. So we heard these reports that patients were doing fairly well for, let's say, 5 to 7 days, and either they got better or all of a sudden they rapidly declined. And that rang a bell with us because that's a pattern that we've seen before in these lung diseases where the lung is compensating for a long time, and then all of a sudden they cannot compensate. So we started a program where we're now receiving scans from all over the world that we analyze free of charge for the physicians to use the technology to understand what is happening in the disease. And very interestingly, where everybody thought that was purely an airway disease, like a typical viral pneumonia disease, we identified that there is a very important vascular component. So it's not just the airways, but it's also the blood vessels that seem to be affected very much by this virus. And the reason why is because this specific virus binds to a certain receptor, the ACE2 receptor in the lung, and that causes the blood vessels to constrict. And if you have constricted blood vessels, it's very difficult for the oxygen to get into the blood. Patients are feeling very poorly. They cannot walk up the stairs. They feel very tired. And also this can eventually end up in being a condition which is called acute respiratory distress syndrome that is typically treated with mechanical ventilation, so the ventilators that everybody's talking about. But the problem is if you don't tackle the underlying vascular issue as well, and you start giving high pressures with ventilators, there is a chance that you can actually make the situation worse. So we see now with the technology, by really using the scans, opening up the black box, that you can very clearly delineate the vascular issue from the airway issue. And then you can start treating the individual problems. And then hopefully in the future, with the next wave, which probably is coming in a few months from now, we can prevent a lot of these patients ending up in a very severe state, ending up in the ICU. So it was almost a logical consequence of using the technology previously in asthma, COPD, lung fibrosis, and so on, and now very rapidly employing this in the COVID-19 patients.
How are you getting the word out that you are doing this free for the doctors?
So we have been working with a few hundred centers worldwide doing clinical trials in the past. So the first thing we did, of course, we reached out to them saying, okay, if you have these patients, you can send us the scans and we will analyze them. At the same time, we are working for many pharma companies and biotech companies, medical device companies. So what we do is we ask them to support the efforts. So we are asking them to support us to analyze these data free of charge. That means that the volume for scans increases very rapidly, but also the insights that we gain from the scans, those insights also are coming at a very rapid pace. These insights, we provide them to the pharma companies, and they're very important for their drug development efforts. So if they see there's a vascular component, they can accelerate their inhaled vasodilators, for instance. If they see there's an inflammatory component, we can look at anti-inflammatory drugs, antiviral drugs, and so on. So it's kind of a very good win-win situation where using very new technology, we can provide immediate feedback to the physician of where the problem is. And we can also provide the insights to the drug and treatment developers to make sure they develop the right treatment at the right time for the right patient.
How quickly can you assess the scan?
So the elements that we're focused on, we can do that in about 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
So the scan comes in, they're AI, deep learning based algorithms that really focus on the zones of importance. And the thing is, we have about tens of thousands of CT scans from the past because we've been doing this for 15 years. So all that knowledge, healthy volunteers, asthma, COPD, pulmonary hypertension. So pulmonary hypertension also suffers from a vascular component, as Dr. Kuhl probably also knows very well. So all that information is now at the back end of these algorithms that can very rapidly assess these scans coming in.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, thank you, Jan. Well, I'm going to ask Dr. Koo about the work that he's doing related to COVID-19.
Okay. I thought since this is a webinar that I would go ahead and try and share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two projects that we're doing. One is just a completely new project for COVID that we just started about 2-3 weeks ago. And it's called countcovid.org, and I'm going to want you to go to that later on. So epidemiology is really just the study of distribution and control of diseases in the population. And the way normally you do epidemiology for these types of things is you just count cases. And you count cases by direct interviews of people out in the field. And traditionally, this is done without testing, and that's the sort of the standard definition of epidemiology. However, in this situation with COVID, we have changed our way of doing things, or it seems like the field has, I don't even know whether it's the field or just the media, but epidemiology is not being studied the same way as normally, because we've relied on testing. So testing is great for diagnosis, and that's been the thing that has come up recently, and really testing in using genetic testing to determine this this virus has only come up in about the last 10-15 years. And we all know that testing is frustratingly low. And so I was looking at that issue and saying, why are we in this situation, and is there another way that we can get out of this situation? Because unless we have the testing, then we don't know who's got the disease. So I was looking at this problem. My background is actually as a physician, and so I know that the testing is really there for diagnosis. So if someone comes in and they have certain symptoms, let's say mild cough and fever, in the beginning we needed to test because we needed to know who has COVID or who doesn't, and who just has seasonal flu. But currently, if you go in to see a physician right now, and if you have a mild fever and cough, they're not going to test you. They're going to presume it's COVID, because right now that's the most likely thing that it's going to be. And we know that we don't have enough tests out there, so why waste the tests on every person that comes in the door? We just don't have enough testing. So ultimately, the testing was there to confirm cases, but not to be used for epidemiology. In order to be used for epidemiology, we need to sample a lot of people, and that would require us having 10 to 1,000 times more testing than is being done currently, which is, it's just not going to happen right now. So let's go back a little bit to just understanding why or what we should be doing. So in population statistics, what we're looking for is this term called prevalence. That's the number of people that are infected per 100,000. So in DeKalb County, where I live, there's about 1 million people. So we're looking for the prevalence in a certain region. And the way we should normally do that is just survey the people in the community. However, traditionally, that means sending out epidemiologists to go and interview people to find out who has the disease and who doesn't. And you can see that's extremely time-consuming and labor-intensive, and just would not be done in this day and age because it's too time and resource-intensive. So I was thinking, what is an alternative? What can we do today? And today we have modern technology. We're all on the internet, and we can all contact each other in a blink of an eye. So why don't we just do that? Websites can reach many people all around the world, and a survey is fast. You've probably all done surveys online, and you can do that very fast. And my question was, why is this system not available? Why doesn't CDC build this? Why doesn't someone else build this? And it just hasn't been done, because in the past, CDC has actually collected data by epidemiologists that go out in the field, and that just takes a long time. And so I said, today we have an issue right now. We need to know how many people have COVID today and how many people will have it next week. I don't want to build something, or I don't need someone to build something that will be good next year or 3 years from now. That's the frustrating part. The tests will be available a year from now, but we need them now. So I said, okay, it's not like I have a lot of time, because right now I have to teach online. I have to try and do that. But I said, we need to do this. So what can we do? So I co-opted everyone that I know, my students at Georgia Tech and my son, who's a commissioner in Gwinnett County, and I said, can we just build this? And so we just built it ourselves, and Ben Koo really built it in almost a day. So we built it ourselves. You have to make it very simple and just ask 6 questions. If you just ask 6 questions, then most people will fill it out. If they go to the site, then they'll fill it out. So it's not available. It was not available 3 weeks ago, and what we did was we just built it. So if you could just go to countcovid.org during this thing or right after, you'll see there's only these 6 questions. It's very simple to fill out. It won't take you more than 20 seconds to fill out. Have you lost your sense of smell, fever, dry cough? I'm not going to talk about the technical things of why we ask these specific things, but it's easy for you to fill out and then just give your zip code so we know how to locate it. I'm not trying to track you. I'm not trying to find out where you live or anything like that. This is just by zip code. So that's the view that you will see today on the website, which is Count COVID. And by next week, we're going to redesign it, but it does the same thing. It's going to look a lot nicer. We have a PR firm that is putting this all together, and they've come up with this sheet, and it'll go through just as fast. Have you had a fever? Have you had cough, etc.? So that's what it'll look like next week. So what can we learn from this? Essentially, we're just asking for that so we can know how many people have the disease in different locations. So we were the first site to publish an estimate of prevalence in the United States. And it's just amazing. There's almost no place you can go to get a prevalence in the United States using the survey. So on the left, this is a current survey of our 4 counties around Atlanta: Cobb, Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett. It's important to know that they're approximately the same, especially if you divide it by the number of populations. So just having the count is crazy. Of course, New York's going to have the most. They have the most people. But that you really want to know how many are they having per 100,000 population. So if you look at New York on the right, this is our survey, and we're getting that there's 20 to 40,000 in certain areas of New York, in Queens and Nassau County. There's a huge amount that are actually there. If you, this is about 50 times, 35 to 50 times what they're saying by confirmed cases. So we actually know that it's spreading a lot. And you might want to think, in Queens and Nassau County, we're getting up that, another way to interpret this is 20 to 40% of the population has been exposed to COVID. And if that's true, then you're starting to get into the herd immunity levels that people are talking about. It's not everywhere, it's not in Georgia, but it is in certain locations. And so we need to know where are these locations and how is it changing over time.
Dr. Koo, can you explain about the herd immunity?
Herd immunity is when most of the people have had it. So if everyone has it, if you say 80% of the people have had it, then they're not going to get infected again. You might as well just let everyone do everything. There are some theoretical reasons that it could be herd immunity at 40 or 50% instead of going to 100%. And there's some, theoretical issues. But if you're wanting to know when you should open up, if there's herd immunity already, then you should just open up. There's no reason to quarantine people. But if they're not there, like in Georgia, we're at 7%, then most of the people that you go out with, the people that have COVID are going to be infecting a lot of people because there are a lot of people that don't have it, okay? And that number is much higher than the 0.2% of cases that are being reported now. So if they're being tested, only 200 out of 100,000 are confirmed, which doesn't tell us anything because we know people aren't testing. In fact, there are about 35 times more people that have COVID symptoms than are being tested. So we know that it's a lot more. So that explains why it's spreading so quickly. So what can we use this information for in the future? Well, we can see if COVID is increasing or decreasing around you because we can track it on a daily basis. And we can tell if you are likely to encounter an infected person at the store. So at 7% right now in Georgia, that means 1 out of 14 people that you encounter may actually have had been exposed to COVID. Doesn't mean they're infected right now, but it could be. So that's where you want to know. And when it goes to much greater amounts, let's say 1 out of 1,000, you know that you're not going to see anyone. I mean, we don't come into contact with 1,000 people unless you go to a Hawks game or something like that. So we'd also like to know, are you in a hot spot? Like, is it going up or down in Gwinnett County? Or how about in your local zip code, Duluth, the people that you're going to be encountering on a day-to-day basis? What's the prevalence rate there? If it's a low prevalence, then it makes sense to quarantine people and to track cases. But if you're at a much higher rate, like at 7%, you're not going to be able to quarantine that many people. So this information could be useful in making some of these decisions. And then also, since it's a fast reaction, then we can see whether relaxation is working or if a second wave is starting and you might want to shut it down. But all that, instead of trying to test everyone, you could find by just tracking or surveilling people on a website. So that's what we'd like you to do is go to countcovid.org. I'm not going to ask you for money. We haven't taken money for this at all. So just pass it on to 10 people and at least get this counted. And we just ask you to do your part to help stop this disease. So another device that we've developed with the CDC is something to try and look for pneumonia. It's called Pneumonia Check. And this was device formed primarily to look for disease in patients with pneumonia, but in COVID, they have pneumonia. So and they need to have Jan's way of seeing how bad it is. But what we're really looking for is just sampling. So you've probably all read how you get sampled for COVID, and maybe many of you don't actually recognize what they're doing, but they're taking a nasal sample. And when you take a nasal sample, you have to put this Q-tip-like thing, it's a wooden stick actually, to the back of your nose and get a sample back there. And you can imagine that it's not easy to do, and so not everyone gets a good sample. And if they don't have a good sample, then you have a false negative because they're not going to have that. And there's been an inadequate supply of these sticks and an inadequate supply of sampling techniques all over, and it uses medical people, and that all takes a lot of resources. So we have an alternative for this, and it's called Pneumonia Check, and all you have to do is blow into this device. Unfortunately, all my devices are at Georgia Tech, and I'm not allowed to get to Georgia Tech, so I couldn't have it for you to show. But this Pneumonia Check uses fluid mechanics to isolate the lung pathogens onto the filter. So this came to me because my colleague at CDC said, the pneumonia is a problem, but it's a problem of things in your lungs. And we need to find out what's in your lungs as opposed to in your mouth. And if you do the other sampling, it's just in your nose and your mouth, and it doesn't tell you what's in your lungs. So we devised this other method to try and find out the blue little particles down there and exclude the ones that are in the X, or to at least separate them. So it's just a small little device like this. You blow into it, cough into it. The first part goes into a bag, and the second part goes onto a filter. And from that filter, you can send it off to PCR to look for COVID virus on that, or you can wash the bag to find out the amount from that. We actually have designed it so that a 3-year-old can do it fine. So everyone can do it at home, and you don't have to have that thing stuck in the back of your nose. So the benefits of Pneumonia Check are that people could collect their specimens at home. Here's a picture of it, and you don't have to have the medical personnel there at the time. So then we could collect specimens from a lot of people, not take up all the medical personnel that should be taking care of the sick people, and we can tell whether the cough is infective or not. So you know that we can spread this by essentially 2 major means. One is by coughing, you spread it into the air and it can go, the 6 feet, and that's infective that way. But some people are infected that way and others aren't. And the ones that are infected by the cough are often called super spreaders. They have a lot of stuff in their mouth, a lot of virus, and they spread it quickly because they're coughing on a lot of other people. but that's actually a rare situation. Most people are not super spreaders, even if they're infected. Another way of infecting is from your mouth, and your hand touches your mouth and you put it on another, let's say the subway pole, and then someone else touches that pole and then puts it in their mouth. So that's a different way of infecting, and that's not nearly as effective on a population basis. So we would like to, if you sample this, we would be able to tell whether a person is shedding a lot of stuff in their cough or not. And ultimately, if we're going to go back to work, we need to know who is infective and who is not. So in this way, we can tell whether they are infective or not by their cough or not, or whether it's just by their mouth. And if they recover from this disease, then we want to know when they are not infected. So by this, we could also sample and see whether they're shedding a lot of virus or not. So that's the benefits of Pneumonia Check. This device is FDA approved, and it's in the United States, although we have not been making a big business out of this. Until pneumonia has come about, it's just not been a big product, and mainly we just developed it for third world countries, but now it's being available for this country too.
So Dr. Koo, you said it's now available. How are you getting that word out, or how are you making it?
Physicians are coming to us and they're ordering that type of thing. We just got an order from Italy because they're wanting to use this instead of what's called a bronchoalveolar lavage. It's a fiber optic scope that goes down your throat, because they've been getting false negatives from the nasal swabs, and when they do the bronchoalveolar lavage, they know it's positive down there from their lungs, but this is a much cheaper and easier way of doing it. So this is sold by a company, mdinnovate.com. You can look at that, but otherwise, it's not really a device for consumers at home. It's really for professionals.
I see. Thank you. And my question here is, how do your companies, medtech companies, navigate all these regulatory requirements? We talked about FDA and all that, but how do you navigate all those requirements in a situation when you really need to move forward very quickly and respond quickly?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. So you do see that certain environments are better or worse equipped for crises and moving fast. So to the regulators' credit, I think in the last couple of weeks and months, they have been quite supportive of emergency use of certain devices, drugs, etc. That's one part of the equation. And the other side of the equation is that IRBs, so ethical committees, institutional review boards, have been very fast in fast-tracking the protocols for COVID-related studies. So that means that if you have an idea, or if you have a device, or if you have some sort of analysis thing that you'd like to do on COVID patients, it is fairly easy to get it through IRB, and then in our case, upload the scans anonymized, so you don't, from a company perspective, you're still following all the GDPR and the privacy rules and regulations. So it is challenging. I think, as I said, to the regulators' credit, they have been stepping up quite a bit. And hopefully post-COVID-19, that would also translate in maybe a more efficient regulatory process around medical devices, which I think can use a little update, having the new technologies in mind, AI-based things, deep learning, etc., where the conventional way of developing things is a little opposite to what we are doing now. So usually you develop something, you have a clinical trial, so you test, 200 patients, then you have a regulatory assessment, and then you have a market authorization, you go on the market. Now, the advantage of artificial intelligence and deep learning is that your machine gets smarter the more you use it. So that means every new analysis adds something to the overall database, adds something to the knowledge base. And there we see that the regulators, and especially the FDA, is interested to see how can we adjust this regulatory system to facilitate those things more and more. So that it's almost a continuous optimization improvement of the technology at hand. So we do see that often in history, crises have been also opportunities. And I think there's an opportunity here to get to maybe a more efficient regulatory system and get better technologies to the patients in a shorter period of time.
The regulatory side is generally very cautious, and I think they've tried to open up a little bit, but you have to remember where they're coming from. So in certain areas like Jan's, I think they're working much more diligently to allow other new ways of forming products. But specifically in ventilators, I've been consulting to a number of projects at Georgia Tech to try and make new ventilators available, because as you all know that there's not really enough ventilators out there. So many of the universities have gone to designing something that could be made very quickly and potentially used in the hospital quickly. But they are actually prevented by law from using it by FDA. So FDA has come up with some new regulations on how to get those things approved. So they think it's much faster than before, because it used to take somewhere around 2 to 5 years to get any ventilator approved. So if they shorten it by 10 times or a 12th the time, then we're talking about 3 to 5 months instead. Unfortunately, as is in the situation of New York, 3 to 5 months from now is not when we need it. We need it today. So that has been a problem, and to my knowledge, even though they have put in some language to say you can use these things and we won't come and prosecute you today, there's enough warnings around it that I think all those new systems that people have developed are actually not being used by physicians. At least I haven't heard of any that have actually been used, except for some small things like you can 3D print a Y, so you can put two patients on one ventilator, things like that are relatively small. Any of the newer designed ventilators or bags that could be used to ventilate patients, I think those are not being used on patients yet.
You know, some things that I saw in the news were talking about how fast you can innovate and design was for example, from Dyson, where I think they developed a new design for ventilators in 10 days.
Right. So I think that people can design them and they can make them within another 10 days, but getting through FDA is still a longer process than is practical for the need right now.
We've studied ventilators and acute respiratory distress syndrome in the past quite intensely. So one thing is to make the ventilator, but then also use the ventilator. It's really almost an art. So setting the tidal volume, setting the right peak and expiratory pressure and all these things. And we see, especially in COVID-19, that if you look at death rates in the ICU with patients on ventilators, they were pretty much double of what you typically expect in ARDS. That was in settings, in ICU settings with very well-equipped staff and knowledgeable people. So there was an underlying issue that was not detected. And that's where we see kind of understanding the disease in more detail is important in order to do the right thing. Because personally, I was a little bit afraid with all the news saying everybody's making ventilators now, and at one point in time, the market would be flooded with ventilators, would be put in the hands of people that might do more medium care and not the specialists in terms of using them. And then I think it's very important to understand what is the right treatment for these individual patients. Because as I said before, we see more and more in these COVID-19 patients that there's a vascular issue. If you have vasoconstriction, if you use high levels of PEEP, peak end expiratory pressure, so put a lot of additional pressure on those lungs, you close off those vessels even more. And if you do that in these patients at the wrong time, you might make things worse. So I do think that it's in everybody's best interest to really understand the disease and then make the right treatments at the right time. And that's where I think technology can really help, and especially sharing the knowledge, and it's what's happening now. And even on social media, you see scientific discussions like never before. which I think is very stimulating, and hopefully that ends up in a better environment for these patients.
How are you collaborating with doctors and first responders to develop devices to treat patients' condition?
Especially the people in the ICU are now very much asking for additional information. So not so long, a week ago, you had these messages coming from people in the emergency room saying, these patients are very different than what we're used to seeing. So they have fairly normal lung compliance, but we simply cannot get the oxygen level a little bit higher. And I'll just show you a few slides where it kind of makes sense why that is. So are you seeing the screen now?
Yes.
So what you see here is on the left-hand side, a typical CT scan. And on the right-hand side, from a healthy volunteer, these are the blood vessels. So if you're healthy, this is pretty much what your blood vessel structure looks like. And this is what we do with our technology. So we do the 3D reconstruction of these vessels. And if you have that 3D reconstruction, you can make a little plot like this. So you can see how the blood volume is distributed over the different sizes of those blood vessels. And here these are, if you're healthy, you follow this line, and there's a small standard deviation. So if you're healthy, you actually follow that line quite well. If you're above the line, that means your blood vessels are larger than what they should be. If you're below the line, that means they're smaller than what they should be. Now, if you look at these COVID patients, so this is the graph for about 100 COVID patients. So you see that in these smaller zones, you're well below the normal line. So that means there is a quite severe level of vasoconstriction happening in those smaller vessels, leading to what's called a little bit of a traffic jam, buildup, let's say, in these larger vessels. If you look at the image itself, you kind of see that. So this is again the healthy situation, and this is a typical COVID-19 patient. So you see a lot of the small vessels, those red zones, have disappeared. The yellow and blue zones have very much dilated. So if you have a patient like this, and you start giving them ventilators, high pressures, and you already know that those small vessels are already constricted, adding more pressure to that will not increase the oxygen level. So the messages that came from the intensive care units make perfect sense. If you just use mechanical ventilation, you will not get the oxygen into the blood. So you need to work with vasodilators, you need to work with other types of treatments to first open up those vessels and then use the right ventilator settings. So we are hoping that by communicating with the people on the front line, so to speak, that we can really help them to select which combination of treatments would work best. Because the worst thing we can do is get into a yes-no discussion, ventilators are good or ventilators are bad. No, ventilators are very good, but they need to be used in the right circumstances, using the right settings. And that's something that we would very much like to facilitate with technology, with insights into the underlying pathophysiology. So that was just an example of where we think that insights are very important to facilitate some of these discussions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the slides. It's always really helps to see it visually, how different they look with a comparison. Thank you. So the last question for me is, what lessons have you learned from COVID-19 that we can apply to improve our responses for a similar crisis in the future?
The next decision that a lot of us, or the governments, are having to face is when to open up, and having some knowledge of what is actually out in the community, not just who's coming to the hospital, would be useful information for them to make those types of decisions.
The fundamental question, I think if you look at really the core of the issue, is that we shut down the economy because we were not able to deal with a respiratory issue. We ran the risk of having a healthcare system that would collapse because too many patients with respiratory conditions would come at the same time. So the lesson should be is how to solve that issue. Because if we solve that issue, there is no need to shut down the economy. There is no need to have lockdowns. And that's where I think we learned that this new virus was not just a viral pneumonia as we knew it from influenza and other viruses. So you see different components. We learned that by really zooming in on the lung pathology, you can understand the underlying conditions more and more. So what I would think that we need to do to prevent another lockdown in 6 months from now is to work with the technology that Dr. Ku developed to understand where do we have these hot pockets, where do we have a potential increase in cases, make sure the hospitals are organized, they can triage the patients, put a mobile CT scanner in the parking lot, like they did in China, like they're doing in Europe, everywhere, and make sure you understand in great detail the pathology of that individual patient, whether it's COVID, whether it's influenza, or whether it's something else, and then use existing treatments, vasodilators, bronchodilators, anti-inflammatory drugs, etc., to keep the patient as stable as possible in the early stage, preventing that very severe ICU requiring element, and then we won't have the collapse of the healthcare system, and we can go to a somewhat business as usual state. I think the director of the CDC a few days ago said we have to be very cautious for the second wave. If it coincides with the flu season, then it could get pretty bad. And I think he's right. So I think we have about 4 to 5 months to really prepare using the technology that Dr. Ku developed, using our technology in the second phase to, again, make sure that the patients are being treated adequately in that early stage. And I think those are the lessons from our end that we have learned so far from this pandemic.
So this portion, I will end my questions and then move on to the question from the audience. We have wonderful questions here. So I'm going to start from the top. So what can we do to help with the efforts to combat this disease? And I think this also means how can the public support the efforts to combat this disease?
It's just simple. I'm just going to push the website again. If you can pass it on to more people, you know, we're able to get a lot of participants at the beginning when we just launched it about a week ago. I just sent it out to my Georgia Tech colleagues, and then they sent it on and went all around the world. Now we're trying to make the website a little bit nicer, you know, the back end a little bit, the computer side's all working a little to handle a lot of people. One of the things that Yoshi-san and I were talking about where I would like to make this available to people in Japan as opposed to just in the United States. Currently, we're restricted by using a zip code. So we have a zip code, then it's a different zip code over in Japan. And so how does one make this appropriate to each country specific? You know, the computer people know how to do that actually quite well. Mm-hmm. Our problem has been with IRB, as Jan was talking about the institutional review boards. We're not allowed to ask for specific information, but you know that Facebook and everyone else is asking, well, they don't even ask you all the time. They just take your information and they can track you exactly, and we are not allowed to do that. So, and I don't really want to keep all that information. I want to keep it on a sort of more global scale, zip code levels, but that's for future generations of this thing. Unfortunately, we just need to build it now. So if any of you are good programmers and know how to want to build it, we're just doing it rapidly.
Okay, thank you. Jan?
No, I think from our end, from the broader public, I think listen to some of the recommendations. I think social distancing is important, it's very important. I think if we collectively decide that flattening the curve is what we are going to do and we should do, and I think it was the right decision at that time, we should all collectively do it. Otherwise, these half measures probably do more harm than good. So I think if the collective decision is to do social distancing, to do the lockdown, shelter in place and so on, we have to adhere to that. In addition to that, if you are a patient with an underlying lung condition, use your medication. Make sure your lungs are in the best shape possible, that if there's another viral attack on those lungs, that you at least have the best starting situation that you can do. I think talk to the people around you, inform yourself about innovations in the medical space, because it is up to the patients, it's up to the public, I think, to also demand innovation from the medical space. So I think listen to the webinars, the very well organized webinars, talk to the people in the field, and then really ask your doctors for the most innovative approaches. And I think that's the way forward. It's the way out of this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. Is there any chance that the 18-month timeline for development of a vaccine can be shortened, and by how much?
I think we have to be very careful.
Okay.
One of the things that we know that vaccines by themselves, they cause adverse events. Like everything, every medication that works has a downside to it. So let's say we have a vaccine candidate somewhat ready in a few months. There will be so much pressure to give it to many, many people at the same time. And then the law of large numbers will say that a percentage of those people will have adverse events. There might even be some deaths related to these vaccines. And I'm not sure in a world that is already so much on edge what the result will be. Whether we'll be happy that we have a vaccine, whether people maybe in the anti-vaccine side will say, look, we've been telling you for so long that this is a bad thing. So I think we should be cautious in rushing to a vaccine. Again, I think there are sufficient alternative treatments to keep the patients in stable conditions that we don't need to rush to a vaccine. Of course, the sooner we have it, the better, without any doubt. But rushing into it, I think, has some risks as well.
Next question. Have we already successfully flattened the curve in Georgia? Does the data indicate that the Georgia governor is correct in opening up gyms and bowling alleys tomorrow? I think, Dr. Koo, you kind of touched upon that in your presentation a little bit.
Currently, our results do not show that it's flattened, but the confirmed cases and the deaths look like they are flattening, but that's where I think it's important to see what's out in the community. So,
yes.
And as far as the political decision of bowling alleys, or I heard, yeah, massage parlors apparently are the thing that you can go to now. That doesn't sound like social distancing, but we'll see.
Yes, it's very complex and confusing. Don't really understand all of that at all. Jan, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think, I think Dr. Koo's technology is really needed to really understand what is the evolution of the cases. I think it's probably wise to keep the measure a little bit longer, but at the same time, we need to move as quickly as possible to a scenario where we can reopen and reduce the crisis to manageable proportions. So we cannot wait until the situation is perfect, because that will never be perfect. We know once we reopen, the cases will increase. That's just the way it will go. But we need to be prepared to have a situation where we don't have the healthcare system collapsing and the death rate is in reasonable vicinity of what we know that a bad flu season has. So I think that's also something which is true. We need to reopen the economy as soon as possible. But yeah, I don't know whether the massage parlors are the first place to start.
Okay, thank you. So how is AI helping in tracking and predicting COVID-19 hotspots?
AI is very useful if there's a lot of data. Currently, we just don't have very much data about prevalence or symptoms and things like that. But as it's being collected, one could see that in potentially just a week or two, that you can apply artificial intelligence to be able to see what symptoms are most correlative with the disease, which one predicts more spread. Are we going up or down? If the incidence is going down, then that certainly would suggest that we should be able to open up more.
Okay, great, thank you. So to Jan, I have a specific question. Do other lung diseases, for example, pneumonia, not have a vascular component? How come the vascular issue was missed with COVID-19?
I think it's topic of ongoing research, but it's the evidence that we see. So in China, they actually looked at CT scans of COVID pneumonia and non-COVID pneumonia. And one of the elements that was clearly different, so with CT scans, you could make a distinction between the two. And one of the elements that was not present in the non-COVID pneumonia, we didn't see the dilation of those blood vessels upstream. So it seems like there is not a lot of vasoconstriction in those smaller vessels. The reason why is that the ACE2 inhibitor to which the coronavirus binds is not involved in the more influenza type, the other type of pneumonia-driven diseases. So it's the specific receptor that this coronavirus binds to that upregulates vasoconstrictors, and that probably in the initial stages constricts some of these smaller vessels. So we believe that is quite typical for COVID-19, which we have not seen in other viral pneumonias.
Thank you. So the next question is, how will this COVID event affect the development of medical technology in the future?
I think that the technology hopefully will continue to advance. We continue to do that, I mean, as a field in many different areas. Certainly there's going to be a lot more attention to these infectious diseases that weren't necessarily, for instance, pneumonia in general causes the most amount of children's deaths in the entire world, but there really haven't been that many people that are working on that very specifically, and I'm hoping that will increase. Certainly the types of things that Jan is doing in understanding lung pathology, while we have respiratory distress and we can't get the oxygen, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the airway side. It could come from the vascular side. It could come from the space in between, and his technology can help us identify that. And that understanding of the basic physiology and its relationship to pathology is a very great, exciting new technique and I think there are going to be advances in other areas too.
The respiratory space, I think this should be the watershed moment where you have sustained innovation in that space. This should be the 9/11 for lung diseases. And just to illustrate that, so we have been developing drugs and treatments for many, many years using spirometry, which is forcefully exhaling into a machine and measuring what comes out. That was the gold standard. Now, in the worst respiratory crisis ever, this technique cannot be used because of the danger for infection. So the gold standard is rendered effectively useless during the worst crisis in the respiratory space that we've ever known. So that needs to be food for thought. That needs to allow us to rethink what we are doing in the respiratory space if we want to prevent another pandemic down the line. So this should, in my opinion, be at least a very big catalyst for innovation in the respiratory space.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. So thank you very much for your questions. And so we will end this session here and we'll hand it over to Al.
Thank you, Nozomi, for this great program. Your moderating in this innovation series is tremendous, so thank you. Additionally, we are appreciative of Dr. Koo. Thank you, Dr. Koo in Georgia Tech, and Dr. DeBacher as well, of course, from Fluida. Very fascinating, very interesting, tremendous insight for what's going on right now, and certainly portends well for the future. So thank you for your innovation leadership, your expertise, and of course all of this on a national and global scale. Speaking of global, Japan American Society of Georgia appreciates all of our members. And for those of you that are already members, we thank you and we look forward to seeing you at upcoming events. For those that are on this webinar and haven't joined yet, please go to JapanAmericanSocietyOfGeorgia.org and you will find us and find an exciting lineup of programs that we're doing virtually now, of course. And the next one of those is for this Saturday, April 25th. The April Nihongo Ego Kai is going to be happening at 1 o'clock. There are a number of other programs that, again, I invite you to look at the website for upcoming events. There are a series of Japanese movies and docuseries. All of these are virtual watch parties. So again, I invite you to go to the website and check that out. Japan American Society of Georgia, of course, is celebrating our 40th anniversary, and that marks a significant milestone for our organization. It's also a significant event for the state of Georgia in that right now, Japan and our friends from Japan are the #1 international investors in our state and have great manufacturing companies and offices all around the state of Georgia. That's significant. It also means that we need to make certain that we take care of our Japanese friends. And that's one of our missions for Japan American Society of Georgia, learning about the culture, being able to work on business policies individually and collectively through our members. Additionally, the trends, patterns, ideas, both for American companies and of course in our specific case, Georgia companies that have invested in Japan. Some of those are the more obvious ones, such as Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines, Aflac. There are numerous others throughout our state that have invested in Japan. We greatly appreciate the relationships that we have with each other, and I'm happy to say they truly bridge across from Georgia over to Asia to our good Japanese friends. Before we go, I also, of course, want to thank Yoshi Domoto. Yoshi is our exec, and if there's a better one out there, I've not found him or her. So again, we genuinely appreciate the extra efforts for Yoshi, all of our members that produce programs like this, and I will conclude with that. Domo arigato.
Thank you, Al. That was the chair of the Japan American Society of Georgia, Mr. Al Hodge, with Hodge Consulting Services, and also former CEO and president of Rome Floyd Chamber in Northwest Georgia. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time at the Japan American Society of Georgia.